When I walked into the bar that night, the last thing I expected was to see my brother, Derek, sitting with my wife, Madison. They were in a corner booth, huddled close, their heads bent toward each other like conspirators. My stomach twisted. The first thought that crossed my mind was denial. It had to be a coincidence. Maybe they ran into each other. But as I watched, Derek placed his hand on hers, and Madison smiled. That soft, intimate smile I thought was reserved for me. I didn't confront them. Not then. Instead, I slipped out, my mind racing. The air felt too thick to breathe, and the world spun like I was standing on a tightrope, teetering. I had always trusted Derek, my older brother, my best friend since childhood. And Madison? She was my anchor, the person who kept me sane when everything else fell apart. To see them together in that way, it felt like someone had taken a sledgehammer to my chest. The next day, I decided to play it cool. I didn't mention the bar. Instead, I started paying attention. Madison's late nights at work. Derek's sudden interest in helping me with house projects. Projects that conveniently gave him excuses to come over while Madison was home alone. The pieces began to click together, forming a picture I didn't want to see. A week later, I set a trap. I told Madison I had a business trip out of town. 3 days, I said, packing my bag while she watched from the doorway. She didn't seem upset. If anything, she looked relieved. That hurt more than I'd like to admit. Derek had called earlier, asking if I wanted to grab a beer, and I told him the same story about the trip. He'd hesitated for a fraction of a second, long enough for me to notice before saying, "Oh, yeah? Well, safe travels, man." That night, I parked my car a few blocks away and walked back to my house. It was dark, the kind of quiet suburban street where everyone's blinds are drawn by 9 p.m. I crept around the side of the house and peered through the living room window. They were there, Madison and Derek, sitting on my couch, drinking my wine, laughing like they didn't have a care in the world. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone. I recorded them for a while, just to be sure I wasn't imagining things. But it was real. Too real. When Derek leaned in to kiss her, I turned away, my chest burning with a mix of fury and heartbreak. I didn't burst in. Not yet. I had a plan and I needed to stick to it. Over the next few weeks, I started preparing. I'm not proud of what I did, but betrayal has a way of twisting you into someone you don't recognize. I installed cameras in the house, hidden ones, to catch every moment of their treachery. I gathered bank statements, emails, anything I could find that tied Derek and Madison together. Every night, I'd sit in my garage, watching the footage, my anger building like a pressure cooker. And then, I found the text messages. Madison's phone synced to our shared cloud account, and one night, while she was asleep, I went through her messages. What I found wasn't just evidence of an affair. It was a plot. They were planning to take everything from me. The house, the savings, even the dog. Derek had convinced Madison that I was too controlling, that she deserved better. They'd been meeting with lawyers, strategizing how to push me out of my own life. I couldn't let that happen. The next morning, I acted like everything was fine. I kissed Madison goodbye before work and even joked with Derek when he called later. But inside, I was boiling. I spent the day finalizing my plan, and by the time I came home, I was ready. That evening, I suggested we invite Derek over for dinner. Madison hesitated for a moment before agreeing. She even smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. I cooked steak, Derek's favorite, and opened a bottle of expensive wine. The three of us sat at the table, pretending everything was normal. They had no idea I knew. "I've been thinking," I said, cutting into my steak. "We should take a family trip. Just the three of us. Maybe up to the cabin." Madison's fork froze midway to her mouth. Derek glanced at her, then back at me. Yeah. That sounds great, he said, though his voice wavered. Good, I said, smiling. We'll leave this weekend. The cabin was remote, deep in the woods, with no cell service and a long dirt road that most people avoided. It was the perfect place for what I had in mind. When we arrived, I pretended everything was fine. We spent the first day hiking, fishing, and pretending to enjoy each other's company. But by the second night, the tension was unbearable. Madison kept glancing at Derek, and he avoided my eyes entirely. That's when I made my move. After dinner, I suggested we play a game. Truth or dare, I said, pouring another round of drinks. Come on, let's make it interesting. Derek hesitated, but Madison, likely emboldened by the wine, agreed. The game started light with silly questions and harmless dares. But then I turned to Madison and said, Truth or dare? Truth, she said, laughing nervously. I leaned forward, my eyes locking onto hers. Have you ever cheated on me? The room went silent. Madison's smile faded, and Derek shifted uncomfortably. What kind of question is that? She said, her voice shaking. Just answer, I said, my tone icy. She didn't, but her silence was answer enough. Before either of them could react, I pulled out my phone and played the video I'd recorded of them on the couch. Madison's face went pale, and Derek's jaw dropped. You think I'm an idiot? I snarled. You think I didn't know? Derek stood up, his hands raised. Look, man, I can explain. Save it, I snapped. You've both already said enough. I reached under the table and pulled out the envelope with all the evidence I'd collected. I've got everything I need to ruin you, I said, tossing it onto the table. The affair, the texts, the plot to screw me over. All of it. Madison started crying, but I didn't care. I'd made up my mind. Here's what's going to happen, I said. You're both going to disappear from my life. I'll give you 48 hours to pack your things and get out of town. If I see either of you after that, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what you did. They tried to argue, but I didn't give them a choice. By the time we left the cabin, they knew I wasn't bluffing. That was 3 months ago. Madison moved out and Derek, well, let's just say he's no longer welcome at family gatherings. I started rebuilding my life, piece by piece. It's not easy, but it's better than living a lie. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder if I could have handled things differently. But then I remember the look on their faces when they realized the game was over, and I feel a twisted sense of satisfaction. Betrayal changes you. It breaks you down, but it also makes you stronger. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that trust is a fragile thing. Once it's gone, there's no getting it back. After Madison and Derek disappeared from my life, I thought I'd finally find peace. But peace has a funny way of slipping through your fingers when you least expect it. The weight of what happened lingered like a shadow, following me everywhere I went. I spent days and a days trying to convince myself that I was free of them, that the betrayal no longer mattered. But the truth was, it did. It wasn't until I received the first letter that I realized my problems were far from over. The envelope was plain, no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 5 words scrawled in black ink. You think this is over? My blood ran cold. For a moment, I thought it might be some sick prank, but something about the handwriting, sharp, almost frantic, made my stomach churn. I tore through the house, checking locks, windows, cameras. Everything was secure. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching. The next few weeks were a nightmare. Letters kept arriving, each more cryptic than the last. I know what you did. It's your turn to pay. You can't escape. I went to the police, but they were useless. Without a clear threat or evidence of who was sending them, there wasn't much they could do. Probably some disgruntled neighbor. the officer said, shrugging as if my life wasn't unraveling. But I knew better. This wasn't random. It had to be Derek or Madison. I started digging. I hadn't heard from either of them since they left town. But I knew how to find people. Derek had a habit of using the same passwords for everything, and I still remembered his favorite, Steelers 1978. Took a few tries, but I managed to hack into his email account. What I found made my blood boil. There were emails between him and Madison, discussing their new life in another state. They were still together, living under new aliases. But there was something else. A name that kept popping up in their correspondence. Elliot. Elliot was their lawyer, the one who had been helping them plot to take everything from me. Apparently, he hadn't just been their legal counsel. He'd also been Madison's lover before she and Derek started their affair. The emails hinted at something darker. A plan that Derek had dismissed as too risky. But Madison, she'd been all for it. Couldn't let it go. I needed answers. Through some sleuthing, I tracked down Elliot. He worked out of a small office in a neighboring city. Posing as a potential client, I made an appointment. When I walked into his office, I wasn't sure what I expected. A slimy opportunist, maybe. But Elliot was unremarkable. Mid-40s, glasses, the kind of guy you'd forget the moment you walked past him on the street. "How can I help you?" he asked, motioning for me to sit. I didn't waste time. "I know about Madison and Derek," I said, watching his reaction closely. His face went pale, but he recovered quickly. "I'm sorry. I don't know who you're talking about." "Don't play dumb," I snapped, leaning forward. "I've seen the emails. I know you were part of their plan. And I know about the letters." For a moment he just stared at me. Then he laughed. It wasn't a nervous laugh, it was cold, calculated. "You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into, do you?" Before I could respond, Elliot reached into his desk drawer. My heart jumped, but instead of a weapon, he pulled out a folder. He slid it across the desk. "Take a look," he said. I hesitated but opened it. Inside were photos of me, at home, at work, at the grocery store. Pages of detailed notes about my routines, my habits. And at the bottom of the stack was a copy of my signature, forged perfectly. "What the hell is this?" I demanded. Elliot smiled, leaning back in his chair. "Insurance. Madison and Derek might have cut ties with you, but they didn't cut ties with me. Let's just say they owe me. And now, so do you." I'd walked into a trap. Elliot didn't just know about the affair. He was orchestrating the aftermath. The letters, the threats, the surveillance. It had all been him, tightening the noose around my neck. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice trembling. Elliot's smile widened. "It's simple. You're going to transfer a significant amount of money into a designated account. Enough to make up for the inconvenience you've caused. And if you refuse," he tapped the folder, "this goes to the police. I've got everything I need to make it look like you've been stalking Madison and Derek, even plotting to harm them. Who do you think they'll believe?" My mind raced. He had me cornered, and he knew it. "I'll need time," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Of course," Elliot said, standing. "You have 48 hours. After that, I go public." I left his office, my head spinning. The walls were closing in, and for the first time I didn't know if I could get out. But one thing was certain, Elliot underestimated me. He thought he held all the cards, but I still had a few tricks up my sleeve. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The drive back home felt endless, my thoughts spiraling into darker and darker places. Elliot thought he had me pinned, but he didn't know me, not really. Fear might have gripped me in that office, but as the miles passed, fear began to twist into resolve. I wasn't going to let him win. Not him, not Madison, not Derek. By the time I pulled into my driveway, A plan had started to form. First, I needed leverage, something that would flip the power dynamic in my favor. I didn't have the resources Elliot had, but I had determination, and sometimes that was enough. I spent the night combing through every piece of data I'd collected during my earlier investigation. Emails, phone records, bank transactions. I wasn't looking for dirt on Madison or Derek anymore. This time, I was focused entirely on Elliot. It didn't take long to find a thread to pull. Buried among Derek's emails was a chain referencing payments to an offshore account. Payments made to Elliot. The amounts were staggering, far beyond what any legal counsel would charge. But it wasn't just the money that caught my attention. It was the attached files. Contracts, agreements, even a scanned signature that wasn't Derek's. It was Elliot's. I stared at the screen, my pulse quickening. The contracts were fake, documents that could only serve one purpose: blackmail. Elliot hadn't just been helping Madison and Derek. He'd been using them, manipulating them into his schemes while lining his pockets. This wasn't just a personal vendetta. It was a pattern. The next morning, I made my move. I'd spent the early hours crafting an email to Elliot. It was simple, direct, and deadly. Elliot, I know about the offshore account. I know about the fake contracts. I have copies of everything. If you think you can pin this on me, think again. You have 24 hours to back off, or I'll make sure the authorities see every last file. Your move. I hit send and waited. The hours dragged, each one heavier than the last. By the time the clock struck midnight, I still hadn't received a reply. My stomach churned, doubt creeping in. Had I overplayed my hand? Was Elliot calling my bluff? Then my phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. I hesitated before answering. Hello. Impressive. Elliot's voice drawled on the other end. I underestimated you. That makes two of us, I said, trying to sound confident. The question is, what are you going to do about it? He chuckled, a low, menacing sound. You're playing a dangerous game, my friend. But I'll admit you've got my attention. Let's talk. No games, I snapped. You're going to drop this, Elliot. The letters, the threats, all of it. And you're going to stay far away from me. Or what? He asked, his tone mocking. Or I make sure every skeleton in your closet gets dragged into the light. Starting with those offshore accounts. There was a long silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was colder than I'd ever heard it. You think you've won? This isn't over. You'll regret this. The line went dead. The next few days were tense, but quiet. No letters, no threats, no sign of Elliot. For the first time in weeks, I started to believe it might actually be over. But deep down, I knew better. Men like Elliot didn't just disappear. They regrouped, recalculated, and came back stronger. And that's exactly what he did. It started with a phone call from my bank. Unusual activity, they said. My accounts were frozen pending an investigation. Then my credit cards stopped working. Bills began piling up, payments rejected. Elliot wasn't just retaliating. He was dismantling my life, piece by piece. Desperation set in. I'd played my hand too soon, underestimated how far Elliot was willing to go. I needed help, but who could I trust? The police were useless, and hiring a private investigator would only drain what little money I had left. That's when I thought of Clara. Clara was an old friend from college, someone I'd lost touch with over the years. She worked in cybersecurity, a field she'd once described as a mix of hacking and detective work. If anyone could help me out of this mess, it was her. I reached out, explaining everything in vague terms. To my relief, she agreed to meet. Over coffee, I laid it all out. The affair, the betrayal, Elliot's threats. She listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable. When I finished, she leaned back, her eyes sharp. You've got yourself tangled in a web of professional-grade manipulation, she said. But if Elliot's as arrogant as you say, he'll have left breadcrumbs. Everyone does. Can you find them? I asked, hope flickering for the first time in days. Clara smirked. Give me 48 hours. True to her word, she delivered. Clara uncovered a trail of transactions linking Elliot to a string of shady dealings. Not just with Madison and Derek, but with other clients, other lives he'd ruined. Armed with this new information, I had everything I needed to take him down. But this time, I wasn't going to confront him directly. This time, I was going to let his own arrogance destroy him. The plan was simple. An anonymous tip to the authorities, complete with all the evidence Clara had gathered. I stayed up all night preparing the package, triple-checking every detail. By dawn, it was done. I hit send and waited. The fallout was swift. Within days, news broke of an investigation into Elliot's practices. His office was raided, his accounts frozen. Clients came forward, each one adding to the mountain of allegations against him. By the time the dust settled, Elliot was facing charges that would put him away for decades. As for Madison and Derek, they disappeared from the headlines, their part in the scandal overshadowed by Elliot's crimes. I never heard from them again, and I was fine with that. They'd made their choices, and now they were just ghosts from a past I was ready to leave behind. For the first time in months, I felt free. The betrayal had left scars, but it hadn't broken me. And as I stood on the other side of it all, I realized something important. The best revenge isn't getting even. It's moving on. And that's exactly what I plan to do. Despite my determination to move on, life rarely lets you tie things up so neatly. In the weeks following Elliot's arrest, I settled into a routine, focusing on rebuilding the pieces of my life that had been shattered. My finances slowly recovered, thanks to Clara's guidance in securing what little I had left, and I even started seeing a therapist to process everything I'd been through. For the first time in what felt like forever, I began to believe I could put the past behind me. That illusion didn't last long. It started with a voicemail, an unfamiliar number, a raspy voice. You thought it was over? It's not. You'll never escape what you did. The message was brief, but the menace in those words was unmistakable. I'd hoped Elliot's arrest would have been the end of it, but someone else was stepping into his shoes, or perhaps carrying on his legacy. I called Clara immediately, my hands shaking. I just got a threat, I said, barely able to keep my voice steady. What if this isn't over? What if someone else is involved? We knew Elliot wasn't working alone, Clara said calmly. He was too connected, too calculated to be a solo act. Let me dig deeper. There's always another layer to people like him. While Clara worked her magic, I took precautions. I installed even more security cameras around my house, hired a locksmith to upgrade my locks, and started carrying a self-defense weapon everywhere I went. The paranoia was suffocating, but it kept me alert. Whoever was behind that voicemail wasn't going to catch me off guard. Days turned into weeks with no further contact. I began to convince myself that maybe it had been a one-off scare tactic. Then Clara called me late one night, her voice unusually tense. I found something, she said, but you're not going to like it. What is it? I asked, dread pooling in my stomach. It's Madison, she said. She's been trying to access Elliot's offshore accounts. She's not just running from the fallout. She's trying to recover his assets. I felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me. Madison was supposed to be gone, a ghost from my past. But now, she was actively trying to claw her way back into the mess we'd all barely escaped. How is she even doing this? I asked. She's not working alone, Clara said. Someone's helping her. I'm still piecing it together, but this isn't small time. They're organized. What do we do? We wait, Clara said. Madison's greedy. People like her always overplay their hand. When she does, we'll be ready. Waiting was torture, but Clara was right. Patience was key. Over the next few weeks, Clara uncovered more pieces of the puzzle. Madison had partnered with a man named Victor Reyes, a name that sent a chill down my spine when I first heard it. Victor wasn't just a criminal. He was a legend in the underworld, known for his ruthlessness and his knack for making people disappear. It wasn't long before Victor made his presence known. I came home one evening to find a single bullet sitting on my kitchen counter, the words "last chance" carved into the metal. My blood ran cold. I called Clara, who told me to get out of the house immediately. She arranged for me to stay at a secure location while we figured out our next move. The final confrontation came faster than I expected. Victor's network was vast, but Clara was smarter. She'd been quietly feeding information about his operations to law enforcement, setting up a sting operation that would take him down. All I had to do was keep myself alive long enough for them to act. That wasn't as easy as it sounded. Victor's men tracked me to the safe house, forcing me to flee in the middle of the night. I barely escaped, my car skidding down back roads as they chased me through the darkness. I managed to lose them, but not before they left me with a clear message. Victor wasn't just coming for me, he was coming for Clara, too. I called her immediately, my voice hoarse. "They know about you. You need to get out." "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "Victor's days are numbered. We're too close to back down now." Her confidence was unwavering, and it gave me strength. Together, we hatched a plan to lure Victor out. Using a fake account, Clara posed as Madison, setting up a meeting to discuss Elliot's assets. It was risky, but it worked. Victor showed up at the rendezvous point, flanked by his men. But instead of Madison, he found a team of federal agents waiting for him. The takedown was swift, brutal, and thorough. Within minutes, Victor and his crew were in custody, their empire dismantled. Madison, however, slipped away once again. Clara and I tracked her to a remote location overseas, but by then, she'd vanished without a trace. Part of me wanted to keep chasing her, to make her pay for everything she'd done. But another part of me, the part that had been broken and rebuilt, knew it was time to let go. Victor's arrest marked the end of a long, harrowing chapter in my life. Clara and I parted ways shortly after, both of us eager to move on. She returned to her work in cybersecurity, and I started over. A new city, a new job, a new beginning. Every now and then I think about Madison, Derek, and Elliot, about the choices they made and the destruction they left in their wake. But I don't dwell on it. Life is too short to carry the weight of the past. I've learned to live in the present, to cherish the peace I've fought so hard to find. And if the shadows of my past ever come calling again, well, this time I'll be ready. The voicemail haunted me for days. Every time I replayed it in my mind, that raspy voice seemed to grow louder, angrier, more sinister. "You'll never escape what you did." I tried to focus on work, on the mundane routines of daily life, but it was impossible. Fear had a way of creeping into everything, making even the brightest moments feel dark. Clara had promised to dig deeper, and she didn't waste time. The following week, she called me with a lead. "I found something," she said, her voice clipped with urgency. "There's chatter on some forums I've been monitoring. Victor Reyes's name keeps coming up. People are talking about debts he's collecting, but it's more than that. He's consolidating power." "What does that mean for us?" I asked, gripping the phone tightly. "It means he's not just after you," Clara said. "He's trying to send a message. And you're the perfect example." "Why me?" I demanded, frustration bubbling to the surface. "I didn't do anything to him. You took down Elliot. Clara said flatly. That cost Victor money and credibility. In his world, that's enough to paint a target on your back. Her words settled heavily on me. Elliot had been a pawn in a much larger game, and I'd unwittingly stepped onto the board. Now, Victor Reyes had made me his enemy, and enemies like him didn't forgive or forget. What do we do now? I asked. Clara paused, and I could almost hear the wheels turning in her mind. We stay ahead of him. If he wants to play games, we'll play smarter. But you need to be ready for anything. He's not the kind of man who stops until he gets what he wants. The next few weeks passed in a haze of paranoia and preparation. Clara coached me on how to secure my digital footprint, teaching me tricks to stay invisible online. I moved into a temporary apartment under an alias, a sparse, sterile space that felt more like a bunker than a home. Every night, I double-checked the locks and watched the security feed Clara had set up, jumping at every shadow. But Victor wasn't the only ghost from my past haunting me. Madison's name kept surfacing in Clara's investigations, always just out of reach. She was still trying to access Elliot's offshore accounts, and now it seemed she'd aligned herself more closely with Victor. The thought of them working together sent chills down my spine. If Madison was anything, she was cunning. Combined with Victor's resources, she was a force to be reckoned with. One night, Clara called me unexpectedly. "We have a problem," she said without preamble. "What now?" I asked, already bracing myself. "Victor's men are on the move," she said. "They've been asking around about you in the city. They're getting close." "How close?" "Close enough that you need to leave," Clara said. Now, panic gripped me, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Where do I go?" "I've set up a safe house," Clara said. "It's out of state, completely off the grid. You'll be safe there while I figure out our next move." I didn't argue. Within an hour, I'd packed a bag and hit the road, leaving behind the fragile semblance of a life I'd been trying to rebuild. The safe house was in a remote wooded area, a small cabin surrounded by towering trees. It was quiet, almost eerily so, and the isolation felt both comforting and unnerving. For the first few days, nothing happened. I stayed inside, my only contact with the outside world coming through Clara. She updated me on her progress, but the news was always the same. Victor's men were still searching, and Madison was still a ghost, slipping through every net Clara tried to cast. Then, late one night, I heard it, the crunch of footsteps outside the cabin. My heart raced as I grabbed the self-defense weapon Clara had insisted I keep nearby. I crept to the window, peering out into the darkness. The forest was still, the moonlight casting long shadows across the ground. The footsteps stopped. For what felt like an eternity, I waited, my breath shallow and my grip on the weapon tightening. Then, just as suddenly as they'd started, the footsteps retreated. I didn't sleep that night, every creak of the cabin settling sending a fresh jolt of adrenaline through me. The next morning I called Clara. "Someone was here last night," I said. "They didn't come inside, but they were close." Clara didn't hesitate. "Pack your things. We're moving you again." The pattern continued. No matter where I went, Victor's men weren't far behind. They never confronted me directly, but their presence was constant, a reminder that I was never truly safe. Clara worked tirelessly to stay one step ahead, but the stress was taking its toll on both of us. One night, after yet another close call, Clara finally admitted the truth. "This isn't sustainable," she said. "Victor's network is too vast, and Madison, she's too motivated. We need a new strategy." "What do you suggest?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. "We take the fight to them," Clara said. "If we keep running, they'll just keep chasing. It's time to turn the tables." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. I knew she was right, but the thought of confronting Victor and Madison head-on filled me with dread. Still, I'd come too far to back down now. "Okay," I said finally. "Let's do it." And so, the next chapter of this nightmare began. But this time I wasn't running. This time I was ready to fight. Clara and I spent the next week planning every detail of our counterattack. If we were going to confront Victor and Madison, we needed to be smart, precise, and ruthless. Clara's connections in cybersecurity and law enforcement gave us an edge, but Victor's network was vast and unpredictable. One misstep could cost us everything. "We need bait," Clara said one night as we worked late into the evening. Her laptop screen glowed with maps, encrypted files, and surveillance footage. "Something that will force them to act." "What kind of bait?" I asked, wary of what she might suggest. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes sharp. "Madison. She's been trying to get to Elliot's offshore accounts, right? We give her an opportunity too good to resist. A breadcrumb trail that leads her straight to us." "That's risky," I said, my stomach twisting. "If she's working with Victor, he'll come too." "Exactly," Clara said. "We want them both. We're not just ending this for you, we're dismantling their entire operation. If we can get Victor in one place, we can coordinate with law enforcement to take him down for good." Her confidence was contagious, but I couldn't shake the fear gnawing at the edges of my resolve. Still, I agreed. There was no turning back now. The plan was simple on the surface but intricate in execution. Clara created a fake offshore account in Elliot's name, complete with false credentials and a series of encrypted messages that appeared to lead to a hidden stash of money. Using her skills, she planted the information where Madison would find it. A digital breadcrumb trail that pointed to a secluded warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Meanwhile, I focused on preparing for the confrontation. Clara's contacts provided me with a crash course in self-defense and tactical awareness. I'd never been a fighter, but I was determined to hold my ground. If this was going to end, I needed to be ready for anything. The night of the meeting arrived faster than I expected. Clara and I arrived at the warehouse hours early, setting up cameras and positioning ourselves strategically. Law enforcement was on standby, ready to move in as soon as we confirmed Victor's presence. The tension was palpable as we waited in the shadows, every creak of the building making my pulse race. Finally, headlights pierced the darkness. A black SUV rolled up to the warehouse, its engine rumbling like a predator stalking its prey. Two figures stepped out, Madison and Victor. My breath caught in my throat as I watched them through the monitor. Madison looked as cold and calculating as ever, her movements sharp and deliberate. Victor was a towering presence, his sheer size and demeanor radiating danger. "They took the bait," Clara whispered, her fingers flying over her keyboard as she tracked their movements. "Let's see how far they go." Madison led the way into the warehouse, her phone in hand as she followed the false trail Clara had laid out. Victor stayed close behind, his eyes scanning the shadows like a predator ready to strike. Clara and I stayed hidden, watching as they reached the center of the building where the supposed account details were waiting. "This is it," Clara said, her voice tight. "Get ready." Before I could respond, Madison's voice echoed through the warehouse. "It's a setup," she snapped, her head whipping around. "We need to get out of here." Victor growled something under his breath, but before they could retreat, Clara triggered the next phase of the plan. The doors slammed shut with a deafening clang, locking them inside. At the same time, blinding lights flooded the warehouse, illuminating every corner. "This is the police," a voice boomed over a loudspeaker. "Victor Reyes, you are surrounded. Surrender now." Chaos erupted. Victor pulled a gun, shouting orders to Madison as he scanned for an escape route. Madison, for her part, looked more furious than afraid. "You idiot!" she hissed at Victor. "I told you it was too easy." From our vantage point, Clara and I watched as the law enforcement team moved in. The next few minutes were a blur of shouting, gunfire, and flashing lights. Victor fought like a cornered animal, but the odds were against him. Madison tried to run, but Clara had anticipated that. A second team intercepted her before she made it to the side exit. By the time the dust settled, both Victor and Madison were in custody. The sight of them being led away in handcuffs filled me with a mixture of relief and disbelief. It was over. After months of fear and uncertainty, the nightmare had finally come to an end. Clara and I stayed behind as the authorities secured the warehouse, watching as the last of the evidence was collected. "You did it," Clara said, turning to me with a small smile. "We did it." I nodded, the weight of everything that had happened finally starting to lift. "Thank you," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "For everything." She shrugged, her expression softening. "That's what friends are for." As we left the warehouse, the cool night air felt like a cleansing breath. For the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to believe that I was free. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. I wasn't the same person I'd been when this all started. I was stronger, sharper, and ready to face whatever came next. The days following Victor and Madison's arrests felt surreal. I expected to wake up and find it was all a dream, that the nightmare would start over again. But the reality of their capture was undeniable. News of Victor's criminal empire's collapse spread quickly, and the media had a field day dissecting every sordid detail. Madison's involvement was a mere footnote in the chaos, but for me, it was the most significant chapter. Clara, ever the professional, didn't let me bask in relief for long. "We need to tie up loose ends," she said over coffee a few days after the operation. "Victor's empire may be crumbling, but his associates are still out there. They'll be scrambling to fill the void he's left behind. And some of them might see you as unfinished business." Her words sent a chill down my spine, but she was right. Couldn't let my guard down yet. Together, we pored over the data Clara had collected during her investigation, identifying key players in Victor's network who might pose a threat. Most were small-time operators, unlikely to pursue me directly. But a few names stood out, individuals with enough resources and ambition to make my life hell if they chose to. One name in particular made my stomach drop, Elias Vargas. Clara described him as Victor's second-in-command, a man known for his cold precision and loyalty. While Victor's arrest had left a power vacuum, Elias had the means and motive to step into his former boss's shoes. "He's going to be a problem," Clara said, her tone grim. "We need to keep tabs on him." "How?" I asked. "The police are already stretched thin dealing with Victor's mess. If Elias goes underground, they won't be able to track him." Clara's lips curved into a small, determined smile. "Leave that to me." Over the next few weeks, Clara worked tirelessly, using every tool in her arsenal to monitor Elias's movements. Meanwhile, I focused on regaining some semblance of normalcy. I moved back into my apartment, cautiously optimistic that the worst was behind me. But the scars of the past months lingered. Every knock at the door, every unexpected sound, sent my heart racing. I knew it would take time to feel safe again. Then, one evening, Clara called with an update. "I've found him," she said. "Elias is laying low, but he's not hiding. He's still operating, and from what I've gathered, he's consolidating power. He's also been asking questions about you." The air seemed to leave the room. "What kind of questions?" I asked. "He's looking for weaknesses," Clara said, "trying to figure out how much you know and whether you're a threat. He hasn't made a move yet, but it's only a matter of time." So, what do we do? Clara hesitated, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of uncertainty in her usually confident demeanor. We're going to have to take the fight to him, she said finally. If we wait for Elias to come after you, we'll lose the upper hand. But if we act now, we can catch him off guard. The thought of going after someone as dangerous as Elias was terrifying, but I trusted Clara. She'd gotten me this far, and I wasn't about to question her judgment now. The plan was straightforward but risky. Clara had pinpointed one of Elias's safe houses, a secluded estate on the outskirts of town. It was heavily guarded, but Clara's research suggested that Elias used it as a base of operations when he needed to regroup. If we could infiltrate the estate and gather evidence of his activities, we'd have enough to bring him down, or at least put him on the defensive. This isn't like before, Clara warned me as we prepared. Victor's arrest was a coordinated effort with law enforcement. This time, it's just us. If something goes wrong, we're on our own. I understand, I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. Let's do it. The night of the operation was tense. Clara and I parked a safe distance from the estate, using the cover of darkness to approach undetected. Clara had outfitted us with surveillance equipment and tools to bypass the security system. Every step felt like a gamble, the stakes higher than ever. As we reached the perimeter of the estate, Clara hacked into the security feed, giving us a clear view of the guards' patrols. There's a blind spot near the south entrance, she whispered. We'll have a narrow window to get inside. We moved quickly, slipping past the guards and into the estate. The interior was lavish but cold, a reflection of the man who owned it. Clara directed me to a study on the second floor, where she believed Elias kept his most sensitive documents. As we entered the study, my heart pounded. Clara immediately went to work, accessing Elias's computer and downloading files onto a portable drive. I stood guard, my grip tightening on the weapon Clara had insisted I carry. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant sound, set my nerves on edge. Then, from downstairs, came the sound of voices. Someone was coming. Clara, we need to go, I whispered urgently. Almost there, she replied, her fingers flying over the keyboard. The voices grew louder, accompanied by the heavy thud of boots on the stairs. Panic surged through me. Clara, done, she said, pulling the drive from the computer. Let's move. We slipped out of the study just as the door swung open behind us. A shout rang out, and suddenly, the quiet of the estate erupted into chaos. Clara and I sprinted down the hallway, dodging gunfire as we made our way back to the south entrance. Somehow, we reached the perimeter without being caught. Clara disabled the security system long enough for us to slip through, and we disappeared into the night. My heart didn't stop racing until we were miles away, the estate a distant memory in the rearview mirror. Back at Clara's apartment, we reviewed the files we'd stolen. They contained everything we needed: evidence of Elias's criminal activities, connections to Victor's network, and even plans for future operations. It was enough to bring him down, but it also painted a chilling picture of just how dangerous he was. This is it, Clara said, her eyes scanning the screen. We've got him. But as I looked at the files, a sense of unease settled over me. Elias wasn't going to go down without a fight, and I had a feeling the worst was yet to come. The stolen files revealed a web of connections far deeper than we'd anticipated. Elias wasn't just consolidating Victor's network. He was expanding it, reaching into legitimate businesses to create a perfect front for his operations. His reach extended to politicians, law enforcement, and even international contacts. It was clear we'd only scratched the surface of his influence. Clara was unshaken. This is what we needed, she said, spreading printouts of the files across her desk. Elias won't be able to explain this away. We hand this over to the right people and he's done. The right people? I asked skeptically. You think anyone in the system is clean enough to handle this? If Elias has his hooks in law enforcement, he'll know the second we try to turn this in. Clara's jaw tightened. That's why we're not going through the usual channels. I know someone. A journalist who's been trying to expose corruption in the city for years. If we give her this evidence, she can make it public before Elias has a chance to bury it. And what happens when Elias figures out it came from us? Clara hesitated, then met my gaze. We have to disappear, at least for a while. Once this goes public, he'll come after us with everything he has. But it's the only way to stop him. The weight of her words sank in. I'd already upended my life to survive Victor's fallout, and now I was being asked to vanish again. But as I looked at the evidence laid out before me, the faces and names of Elias's victims, I knew there was no other choice. Let's do it, I said finally. Over the next few days, Clara worked tirelessly to secure our escape while I helped compile the evidence into a format the journalist could use. Every detail had to be airtight. If Elias found even a sliver of plausible deniability, he'd spin it to his advantage. The night we handed off the files, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Clara's contact, a sharp-eyed woman named Elena, met us in a crowded cafe. She'd brought a satchel, and as Clara slid the flash drive across the table, Elena slipped it into the bag without a word. Her only comment was a quiet, "You've just lit a fuse. Be ready for the explosion." Clara and I spent the next few days in a haze of paranoia. The story broke within 48 hours, plastered across every major news outlet. Headlines screamed of corruption, of Elias Vargas's empire of crime, and of the hidden rot within the city's institutions. The fallout was immediate. Officials distanced themselves, allies turned on him, and warrants were issued. But Elias didn't go quietly. The first sign of his retaliation came the morning after the story broke. Clara's apartment was ransacked while we were out, her computer equipment smashed to pieces. A note was left on the kitchen counter, scrawled in red ink. "You can't run forever. He's trying to scare us," Clara said, though her voice wavered. "It's a scare tactic." "It's working," I admitted. Clara didn't respond. Instead, she started packing. We moved to a motel on the edge of town, constantly changing locations every 2 nights. Each day brought new reports on Elias's unraveling network, but with every headline, the danger to us grew. Clara monitored encrypted forums, tracking chatter from Elias's loyalists. The messages were chilling. Promises of revenge, plans to flush out whoever had betrayed them. "We need to leave the country," Clara said one night, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. "I have a contact who can get us new identities. It's the only way we'll be safe." I hesitated. The thought of leaving everything behind was suffocating. But what choice did we have? Elias wasn't going to stop until he found us, and I'd seen enough of his methods to know what that meant. "Okay," I said, "let's do it." The next few days were a blur of preparations. Clara's contact, a man named Julian, was as efficient as he was discreet. Within a week, we had new names, new documents, and a plan to cross the border undetected. But as we prepared to leave, something unexpected happened. A tip came through one of Clara's backchannels, a location where Elias was hiding out. It was a remote villa, heavily guarded but isolated. If we acted quickly, we could pass the information to the authorities before Elias had a chance to move. "This could end it," Clara said, her voice trembling with a mix of hope and fear. "If we take this chance, we might not have to run." The decision weighed on me like a stone. Go after Elias one last time, or disappear forever and hope his reach didn't extend beyond the borders. Neither choice was without risk, but deep down, I knew what we had to do. "Let's finish this," I said. Clara nodded, and for the first time in weeks, a spark of determination returned to her eyes. "Then we'd better move fast." The decision to confront Elias at his villa was the riskiest move we had ever made. Clara and I knew the odds were stacked against us, but we couldn't keep running. If we didn't end this now, Elias would hunt us forever. The drive to the villa was long and silent, the tension thick in the air. Clara had mapped out every detail of our approach, using satellite images and intelligence she'd gathered from her contacts. The villa sat on a sprawling estate, surrounded by dense forest. It was heavily guarded, but the remoteness worked in our favor. If we were careful, we could get close without being detected. As we parked the car a mile from the villa, Clara handed me a small device. "This is a scrambler. It'll disable their communications temporarily, but only for a few minutes. We'll have to move fast once it's activated." I nodded, trying to steady my breathing. "And the backup?" "They're on standby," Clara said. "Once we confirm Elias is there and we've collected the evidence, we call it in. They'll move in immediately. And if something goes wrong?" Clara's eyes met mine, unwavering. "Then we get out. No matter what." The forest was dark and silent as we approached the villa. Clara led the way, her movements precise and calculated. Every step felt like an eternity, my heart pounding in my chest. When we reached the edge of the estate, we paused, hidden in the shadows of the trees. Clara pointed to a side entrance, guarded by 2 men. "We'll use the scrambler here. Once it's active, we move quickly. Stick to the plan." I swallowed hard and nodded. Clara activated the scrambler, and within seconds, the guards' radios crackled and fell silent. They looked confused, distracted, and it gave us the opening we needed. Clara moved first, disabling one guard with a precise strike to the neck. I followed, adrenaline surging as I knocked the other guard unconscious. We slipped inside the villa, the interior dimly lit and eerily quiet. Clara pulled up a blueprint of the estate on her tablet, guiding us toward Elias's office. As we moved through the halls, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every shadow seemed to shift. Every creak of the floorboards felt like a warning. Finally, we reached the office. The door was locked, but Clara had come prepared. Within seconds, she'd picked the lock, and we slipped inside. The room was lavishly decorated, a stark contrast to the chaos outside. Clara immediately began searching the desk, her fingers flying over the keyboard of Elias's computer. "This is it," she whispered. "I've got access to his files. Give me a minute." I stood by the door, my grip tightening on the weapon Clara had insisted I carry. The silence was suffocating, every second stretching into an eternity. Then, from the hallway, I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps. "Clara, we have company," I hissed. "Just a little longer," she said, her voice steady but urgent. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I raised the weapon, my hands shaking. The door burst open, and a man stepped inside, his gun already drawn. Without thinking, I fired. The sound was deafening, and the man crumpled to the floor. Clara looked up, her eyes wide. "We need to go. Now." She grabbed the portable drive and stuffed it into her bag. We bolted from the office, the villa erupting into chaos as alarms blared. Guards appeared from every direction, and we fought our way through, the adrenaline dulling the fear and pain. By the time we reached the perimeter, Clara was limping, blood staining her sleeve. "Keep going," she urged, her voice tight with pain. "We're almost there." We stumbled into the forest, the sounds of pursuit growing fainter as we pushed forward. When we finally reached the car, we collapsed inside, gasping for breath. "Did you get it?" I asked, My voice shaking. Clara held up the drive, a small, triumphant smile on her lips. Everything we need. The drive back to the city was a blur. Clara called in the backup team, providing them with the coordinates of the villa and the evidence we'd gathered. By the time we reached our safe house, the news was already breaking. Elias Vargas had been captured, his empire dismantled in a coordinated raid. Clara and I sat in silence, the weight of everything that had happened settling over us. We'd done it. The nightmare was finally over. But as I looked at Clara, her face pale and her body battered, I knew the scars of this fight would linger for a long time. "What now?" I asked. She gave me a tired smile. "Now we disappear." The coordinated raid on Elias's villa marked the end of a chapter, but it didn't bring the closure I'd hoped for. Even with Elias captured and his empire crumbling, the shadows he'd cast over my life lingered. Clara and I had succeeded, but the cost had been steep. Physically, mentally, and emotionally. The morning after the raid, Clara and I watched the news in silence. Reports detailed the evidence we'd gathered, the arrests made, and the vast criminal network Elias had operated. Officials spoke confidently about dismantling what remained of his empire, but Clara's skepticism mirrored my own. "They're patting themselves on the back too soon," she said, her voice flat. "Elias's network was too big for them to clean up overnight. There are people who'll try to take his place. People who won't forget that we were the ones who brought him down." "So what do we do?" I asked. "We stay ahead of them," Clara said. "And we don't stick around to find out who comes looking for us." The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. Clara's contact, Julian, expedited new identities for us, complete with passports, credit histories, and cover stories. We packed what little we could carry, leaving behind anything that might tie us to our former lives. Clara handled everything with the same precision that had kept us alive through Elias's pursuit, but I could see the toll it was taking on her. Her movements were slower, her silences longer. "You've done enough?" I told her one night as she pored over yet another set of contingency plans. "You don't have to keep running with me." She looked up, surprised, and for the first time, I saw uncertainty in her eyes. "You think I'm doing this for you?" she asked, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "We're in this together, until the end." We left the city under the cover of darkness, driving through back roads and changing vehicles twice before reaching a small, nondescript airport. Julian had arranged a flight to South America, where we'd start new lives in a place where Elias's reach wouldn't extend. As the plane took off, I stared out the window, the sprawling lights of the city shrinking into darkness. It felt like leaving behind a version of myself I'd never fully know again. Life in our new identities was quiet, almost too quiet. We settled in a small town, its cobblestone streets and warm, humid air a stark contrast to the chaos we'd left behind. Clara found work in cybersecurity, taking on freelance projects that allowed her to stay under the radar. I worked odd jobs, trying to find a sense of purpose in the monotony. For months, we lived like ghosts, blending into the background and avoiding unnecessary contact with anyone who might ask too many questions. It was a fragile peace, but it was peace nonetheless. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was temporary, that someday someone would come looking for us. One evening, as Clara and I sat on the porch of our small house, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she broke the silence. "Do you think it's over?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I took a long breath, weighing my words. "I think it's as over as we can make it. But people like Elias, they leave ripples. There's always someone looking to pick up the pieces." She nodded, her expression distant. "Then we stay ready. We'd learn to live with the shadows, to accept that the scars of what we'd been through would never fully heal." But in that quiet moment, as the last light faded from the sky, I allowed myself a sliver of hope. We'd survived the worst. Maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to move forward. Life in the quiet town brought a rhythm that Clara and I had never known before. The days were slow, marked by the hum of cicadas in the afternoon heat and the distant sound of waves rolling onto the shore. Yet, even in this idyllic setting, the weight of the past refused to fully lift. Every shadow held the potential for danger, every unfamiliar face a possible threat. Clara threw herself into her cybersecurity work. Her ability to dismantle online threats and construct untraceable networks had gained her a reputation among discreet clients. She worked long hours, her focus unwavering, as if keeping busy could keep the ghosts at bay. I, on the other hand, struggled to adapt. The odd jobs I picked up, painting houses, repairing fishing boats, were a welcome distraction, but they couldn't fill the void left by the life I'd abandoned. Nights were the hardest. Sleep came sporadically, haunted by fragments of the past. Elias's villa, the gunfire, the fear that had gripped me for so long. One night, Clara found me on the porch, staring out at the dark horizon. "You're not sleeping," she said, sitting down beside me. Her tone wasn't accusatory, just matter-of-fact. "Neither are you," I replied, offering a faint smile. She sighed, her gaze fixed on the stars. "I keep thinking about what you said, about ripples. You're right. People like Elias don't just disappear. They leave holes that others will try to fill. Do you think they'll find us?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she pulled her knees up to her chest, a posture I'd come to recognize as her thinking stance. "They might, eventually, but by then we'll be ready." Her confidence was reassuring, but I couldn't shake the unease that lingered like a low fog. "What if they come sooner?" Clara turned to face me, her expression serious. "Then we fight, just like we always have." Her words settled something in me. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of resolve. We'd been through hell, but we'd survived. If the past had taught us anything, it was how to endure. The days turned into weeks, and slowly, the fear began to recede. Clara and I found solace in the little things. Morning coffee on the porch, the smell of the sea breeze, the way the town came alive during the evening markets. We became part of the community, not enough to draw attention but just enough to feel a semblance of belonging. But the past has a way of creeping back when you least expect it. One afternoon, as I was repairing a fishing net for one of the locals, a man approached me. He was tall, with sharp features and a weathered look that suggested he'd seen his fair share of hardships. Something about him set off alarm bells in my mind, though he spoke with the friendly ease of a tourist. "You're good with your hands," he said, nodding to the net. "It's a skill you pick up around here," I replied cautiously. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm passing through. Thought I'd explore the area, maybe meet some locals." "You've been here long?" "A little while," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Nice place to settle." He nodded, his gaze lingering a moment too long before he walked away. I watched him go, my gut churning with unease. Later that evening, I told Clara about the encounter. "You think he's one of them?" she asked, her brow furrowed. "I don't know," I admitted, but something about him felt off. Clara didn't dismiss my concerns. Instead, she doubled down on securing our home, checking the surveillance systems she'd installed and updating our contingency plans. "If he's here for us, he won't act alone," she said. "We'll wait and see if anyone else shows up." The following days were tense. I caught glimpses of the man around town, always watching but never approaching. Clara and I stayed vigilant, but nothing happened. Just as we began to think it might have been a coincidence, a second stranger arrived. This one a woman, her demeanor colder, more deliberate. "They're scouting us," Clara said grimly. "Testing the waters before making a move." "Then what do we do?" I asked. Clara's eyes hardened. "We send a message." That night, we prepared for the confrontation we both knew was coming. Clara's skills gave us an edge, and our resolve was stronger than ever. We weren't just fighting for survival anymore. We were fighting to reclaim the peace we'd built, however fragile it might be. As the first signs of dawn broke over the horizon, I felt a strange sense of calm. The shadows of our past had found us again, but this time, we were ready to face them head-on. The confrontation came sooner than we expected. Just as the first rays of sunlight spilled over the horizon, Clara and I caught movement near the perimeter of our property. The two strangers were back, but they weren't alone this time. A third figure joined them, a stocky man with a scar running down his cheek. Their body language was deliberate, their intent clear. "They're moving in," Clara whispered, her voice calm but firm. She was already at the surveillance console, tracking their movements through the cameras she'd installed. "They're testing us. We don't give them the chance," I said, gripping the weapon Clara had insisted we keep ready. My palms were sweaty, but my resolve was solid. We had prepared for this. The plan was simple. Clara's technical skills would disrupt their coordination, while I handled the direct confrontation. It wasn't ideal, but it was the best option we had. Clara activated a scrambler, cutting off their communication devices, and I positioned myself near the front of the property where they were likely to breach. The first man, the one who had approached me by the docks, crossed the threshold cautiously, his head swiveling as he scanned for signs of movement. He didn't see me until it was too late. I stepped out from behind the cover of a tree, my weapon trained on him. "Don't move," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through me. His hands went up slowly, but his eyes flicked to the side, signaling to someone behind him. Before I could react, the woman appeared, her weapon drawn. A shot rang out, but it wasn't hers. Clara had taken her out from the second-story window of our house, her aim precise and unyielding. The man lunged at me, but I was ready. The struggle was brief and brutal, ending with him unconscious on the ground. I looked up to see the stocky man advancing, his scar catching the light. He carried himself like someone who'd seen countless fights and walked away from all of them. This one wouldn't be easy. "Stay down," I called to Clara through the earpiece. "I'll handle him." The man didn't hesitate. He charged, and I barely had time to sidestep his first attack. His strength was overwhelming, each blow forcing me to retreat. But I'd learned to fight with purpose, and his brute force couldn't match my precision. I waited for an opening, then struck, using his momentum against him. He hit the ground hard, dazed but not out. "Enough!" Clara's voice rang out as she emerged from the house, her weapon trained on the man. "It's over. Call off your people." He glared at us, his lips curling into a sneer. "You think this ends with me? You're fools if you believe that." "Maybe," I said, stepping closer. "But you won't be the one to find out." Clara hit him with a tranquilizer she'd prepared, and within seconds, he was unconscious. We secured the intruders, binding their hands and searching them for clues about who had sent them. What we found confirmed our worst fears. A small emblem sewn into the lining of the stocky man's jacket, a symbol tied to Elias's remnants. "This isn't just about revenge," Clara said, examining the emblem. "They're rebuilding. This was a test and we passed, but it's not over." We contacted the local authorities anonymously, leaving the intruders bound and unconscious in a remote clearing with just enough evidence to tie them to Elias's network. Then we packed what little we could carry and left before anyone could trace us. The road ahead was uncertain, but Clara and I knew one thing. We couldn't keep running forever. The peace we'd built was fragile, and the world we'd escaped would always try to pull us back in. But we were no longer the same people who had fled into the night. We were stronger, sharper, and united by a bond forged in fire. As we drove away from the town that had briefly been our sanctuary, Clara reached over and took my hand. "We'll find another place," she said. "We always do." I nodded,